So we're in this lovely class of ours. We're 4 weeks in, and uh, we're starting with Princess Bride. And as a way in, it's worthwhile to ask ourselves where we've been. And we've been for these 3 weeks prior and into this week, reminding ourselves occasionally that this all started when Paul visited Corinth after he had been in Thessaloniki and been thrown out, been in Athens and had mixed results, both relatively short stays. Paul went to Corinth and stayed for 18 months. Some say it's because they were slow learners about Christianity. Others say that he had opportunity without persecution, but for whatever reason, he stayed abnormally a long time, and it's covered in Acts 18. After Paul left, Apollos came to town, and we, in the first 4 chapters, tracked the relationship between the Corinthians and their various leaders. Paul, then Apollos, and maybe Peter even stopped through. And so Apollos became, for some, an inroad into this Christian community. We characterize them as maybe a higher crust, an upper crust of Corinthian culture, a little more than Paul's had been. Whatever was happening, Paul wrote a short letter sometime during that stretch in which he dealt with their boundaries. He said, I don't want you hanging out with immoral people. And in this letter, he comes back and corrects that and says, I didn't mean people generally. I meant people in the church who are living immorally. Because if you didn't hang out with immoral people in the world, you'd have to leave the world. That was in chapter 5 last week. Then they write a letter to him, which we're going to open tonight. And of course, Chloe's people visit and give him even more information. And so Paul has a whole lot of portals of intelligence. And then, in light of the letter and Chloe's reports and all that has gone before, he takes up pen and writes First Corinthians, what we know as First Corinthians. And so we will get eventually near the end of our class to talking about what happened subsequently, right all the way up till the end of the first century when we see a letter from Clement of Rome to the church in Corinth. So there will be legacy down the line. But for now, let's hop into the question of Paul's authority just briefly, because it's going to come up a couple times tonight. Remember now, Apollos came, and some people thought, I'm really not a Paul person. He is not my president, so to speak, right? He's not my leader. And there became these rifts that Chloe's people reported to Paul. And so in 5:3, we saw him pronounce judgment on the man who was sleeping with his father's wife and do it in somewhat authoritative tone. In 7:10, we'll hear him call on the Lord's authority because he kind of quotes a Jesus passage. In 7:25, we'll see that Paul gives advice to say single and says, I think my voice is trustworthy. And then finally, in a very kind of I find it a winsome moment in 7:40, he gives sort of last counsel to them on this whole issue that we're treating tonight and says, and I think I too have the Spirit of God, right? So several times in the course of 5 through 7, Paul calls on authority bases, and we know why, because they were still milling around with who their proper leader would be. Now, let's then get to the topic of the night, Pauline's exegesis. Exegesis, as you know, is the practice of interpreting texts, figuring out what the text said in their ancient environment. And it's a widely used term to talk about biblical interpretation, especially what's happening in the scriptural times. We go to the word sexegesis for obvious reasons because we get to a lot of issues around sex and relationships in this stretch of the letter. And so as we do that, let's just remind ourselves. Kelly got a note from one of you that you didn't have a firm grasp of this person didn't have a firm grasp of where we are going in the class and how things parse out week to week. So we went the first 2 weeks through that relationship with Paul and Apollos and the Corinthians. Then we moved in the third week, last week, to the faith formation in Vegas topic that took up 1 Corinthians 5:1 through 6:11. And now tonight we're 7:12 through 6:12 through 7:40, exegesis. Next week we get to that very current issue of meat sacrifice to idols and what that had to do with the boundaries of the community, what it had to do with how the community related it to itself. It will be a tremendous, I speak facetiously, but it'll be a tremendous insight into Paul's theology to sit with that issue with the Corinthians. Then on 17 and 24, we'll talk about issues that arose as they gathered for worship with one another. And those are covered in 11 through 14. That will be the weeks of 17 and 24 February. And then finally, we do in the final session, raised bodies, open wallets. Paul does both a collection at the end, and prior to that, his resounding passage on the resurrection, chapter 15, longest chapter in the letter. So we're giving it its own time, and then we'll briefly touch chapter 16. Okay, that's just to orient you, and I think I will send out the schedule with my next email on Thursday, so you have it in hand. Finally, how does Paul order this section? We saw that in 5:1 to 6:8, maybe even through 6:11, he takes on their aptitude as judges. Remember, in the first case, they didn't toss the guy who was sleeping with his father's wife, and Paul rebuked them for that, held their feet to the fire about that, because he thought they surely should have removed the man from their presence because he was a bad apple, because he needed to be away for a while in a timeout so he could come back. However Paul would have phrased it, he took them on about their ability to judge that situation. And then in chapter 6, they got in trouble for not being very wise with their judgments. Again, when he found out that they were suing one another in Roman courts, he asked, "Is there not a single person among you who can arbitrate this dispute?" And so broadly, the theme that we saw in 5:1 through 6:8 as most prevalent was the issue of their judgment and their ability properly to judge matters. In 6:9 through 20, he turns to theologies of the body, theirs and his, and that's where we're going to start tonight. Their view that body is disposable and trivial, his view that body is created and purposeful, and we'll get to that in a moment. In 7:1 through 16, he goes through several options for how people can be in relationship. He goes through marriage and singleness, virginity, divorce, separation, all kinds of things. And that will be in 7:1 through 16. And then, having in that opening section made a small plea for singleness, advertising that the way he was doing life as a single man was probably the best if they could carry it off. And we'll get to that extended treatment of it in a moment. Now, at long last, dueling theologies of the body. In chapter 6, we see there, and I'm assuming you have your Bible open to chapter 6 and 7 of 1 Corinthians. This is taken from it, but you'll be able to follow better if you have it in front of you. Here, scholars put quotation marks in your text. I haven't put them here because I've put speakers' names, but you've got in your text of New Revised Standard or New International, most editors put quotation marks because they hear, as I hear, in this passage, Paul quoting them and then answering them. So, first, all things are permitted for me. And Paul answers back. The Corinthians say, all things are permitted for me. And Paul answers back, but not all things are beneficial. They say, all things are permitted for me. And Paul says, but I will not be dominated by anything. And then he quotes a longer sentence from them. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. Paul answers back, the body is meant not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord and will also raise us by his power. Now, I want to beam in on the theology of body here because they see body as expendable. They see the physical self, and this wasn't uncommon in Greek circles. Plato famously disparaged body as a step down from the ideal, and material things often as a step down from the ideal. The forms that were elsewhere, the ideal things, were not within the body. And so there came, in some parts of Greek thinking, this sense that the body was kind of like a shell we had to put up with. For Paul, he sees it as, and we'll get to the full bit, but he sees it as a purposefully chosen vehicle in which to put what? A soul, in which to put meaning, and eventually in which to house the Holy Spirit. So you've got two ways of looking at body, and Paul is tracing some of their sexual immorality to the fact that they aren't taking the body seriously enough. We could spend a minute here, but I won't, sort of translating that and asking what are the theology of body that are around us in our time. I don't think this is a relevant conversation for what we see around us. It happens differently in 21st century US culture, but it's not a bad signal to ask questions about what we think the theology of our bodies is. What is God up to in them? Do you not know? And here he continues to uh, sing out the value of the body. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Should I therefore take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. In other words, it is not inconsequential what you're doing with your body when you're throwing yourself at a prostitute or at your father's wife or, right, the immorality that Paul started mentioning in 9 of chapter 6, he now brings back. Don't you know that whoever is united to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is said, the two shall be one flesh. But anyone united to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Shun sexual immorality. Every sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against the body itself. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you were bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. Do you see how Paul continues to direct a theological interpretation of the self into the lives of people he thinks are too flippant about this being, this physical self of theirs, and therefore are tolerating and engaging in acts of immorality that a Jew of his age, a Jewish Christian of his age, finds very Gentilish, right? We've talked last week about how the spheres of moral, sort of morality around sexuality would have been very different. The mores, the expectations, the rules and laws around sexuality would have been very different in the wider Gentile world, mostly, than in Judaism and in early Christianity. Here, Paul goes right at why. You all don't take the body seriously. You're new to this thing. I get it. But God cares about your body. In fact, it's a habitation for the divine. Again, I think there are a whole lot of good questions. We may get questions about this during the question and answer time, but there are a whole lot of ways to ask this sort of question in our time as well. So if that is his entree into this section, a sort of preliminary preemptive strike on the body being important. Now he moves to the way that relationships go. And this is an ancient image of wedding preparation. Uh, and so we get to a little information about what we see in shadow reading the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 7. We've talked about how Paul's getting a lot of information about them. As we go through the readings that we're just about to do, we'll see that in verse 1 of chapter 7, Paul names a question they have especially asked. And we'll get back to it, but some are abstaining from sex within marriage. It's become very clear. They've got this idea, and it's ironic given where we just were. But some have the idea that if marriage is spiritual, abstaining from sex within marriage would be super spiritual, right, Paul? And so the line is, it is good for, we know that it is good for man to not touch his wife. That's this opening line of 7:1, right? And then Paul will back off it, but it gives us their takes. There's a faction within the group that thinks it's super spiritual to be celibate while married. Second, some are possibly seeking divorce from a Christian sister to be abstinent and not cause her trouble. Third, some are possibly seeking divorce from a pagan to be abstinent. So you see this faction that's asking the question is trying to practice celibacy within their married setting. And they're dealing with it in different ways. Some of them are just doing that. Others are seeing ways to get out of the relationship because as they were married before they became Christians, and now they're thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't be in this marriage. And so we'll get to what Paul does, but this is what I've shadow read as their sort of communications that Paul has heard in advance. And it may all be in the letter, or it may be parts of what he's heard through other means. But now let's go and read. As we go, we have another ancient example of abstinence enforced in a marriage. Lysistrata is a famous ancient poem by Aristophanes. I think it's his best. He was a comic poet, and he wrote a poem about how the women of Athens got tired of their men fighting battles, the Peloponnesian War. And so they gathered all the women from around who were on both sides of the war, and they got them together and said, let's do a sex strike. Men can't have any sex until they end this war. And it becomes comical. But it's the thing that came to my mind this go round when I pictured a bunch of, it seems like mostly men in Corinth who were saying, oh, God says I can't have sex with you, right? This sort of semi-sex strike isn't something Paul embraces with them. And here's why. 7:1 is where we're starting. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And by the way, as we'll find out, the word woman often means wife if in certain contexts. We could translate this not to touch his wife because of where Paul goes with the conversation. But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should, and here have is euphemistic for sex, each man should have his own wife. And notice the parallels. Each woman should have her own husband. The husband should give to his wife what is due to her, and likewise the wife should give to her husband what is due to him. Notice the parallels. We'll come back to that. But just for a second, realize that Paul has had them propose a super spirituality that would abstain from sex even in marriage. And he has answered back, that'd be great, except you aren't up to it. He's just talked about people who are frequenting the prostitutes. It may be that some of them are doing that because they're trying to hold out from sex in their marriages, right? That they've taken on this new asceticism that they aren't quite capable of. And Paul's view of Gentile sexual morality. Paul says, don't even try this. So have relations with your wife, and wives have relations with your husbands. And he does it in parallel ways that I've never found a similar level of equality in the bedroom relations of antiquity. That the culture of Greece and Rome was generally more hierarchical, patriarchal, and men had control of their wives legally, and there were a lot of things that made it tilted. This is an extremely level playing field that is alien to the culture around Paul at the time. All right, so this continues his view of an equal marriage, for the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Don't deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self control. Again, his estimate of their powers. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. So what began as a social statement and a psychological, social, relational statement now becomes we are gifted differently. I don't know how many of you are sort of familiar enough with First Corinthians to know that in chapter 12, we're going to get to a whole chapter on spiritual gifts. In fact, it's going to span 12 to 14. Here he is saying that celibacy is a gift and the inability to be celibate is a part of what some people are dealt. And he is putting another theological framing in and says you aren't gifted at this and you're trying to do it, it's only going to lead to harm, to immorality, but also possibly to other harms. So he wants marriages, in this case, he wants marriages to be equal in their in their relationship to one another relative to all of this. And he also wants it to be continuous so that temptations don't arise, right, from abstinence. Now, we happen to have really cool ancient documents around the issue of marriage and things that people were concerned about. This is a papyrus from Egypt around the same time as Paul is writing, and it just gives you a flavor for the fact that these were real marriages happening in real time. It's easy in biblical reading and from a distance to get this sort of broad category view about, okay, marriage, not marriage, whatever Paul is talking about. But these were real people who, in this case, H acknowledges to WF that he's received from him a dowry on his daughter, W, who has previously been living with H as his wife. And so this points out that there are gradations of the custom of marriage in the Roman Empire. There is sort of de facto marriage, which is living together consistently, that then gets more formal when a dowry is added and it looks like it's going to last. And then it has even other levels in mostly in the upper classes, but this one has gotten to the dowry stage. And as a parapherna, um, and without a valuation in usufruct, that means you get to use the stuff. And as a gift from the current year, then there are more details. Wherefore, let the parties to the marriage, W and H, live together blamelessly as they have previously been doing, H conducting all the agricultural work of each year on the field. If a difference arises between them, and they separate from each other, whether H sends away W or she voluntarily leaves him, the field shall belong to W, or if he's no longer alive, or to H, or if he's no longer alive to W, and H shall moreover return to her the aforesaid dowry and the paraphernalia, whatever state they may eventually be through where. The case of dismissal immediately, excuse me, in the case of dismissal, I'm sorry, you are over part of this. My image of you is over part of this. In the case of dismissal immediately, and in the case of her voluntary departure, within 30 days of demand. I want you to note that in this, there are 6 different Greek words, and I didn't bring you the whole text because it would take a while, but there's 6 different Greek words that describe divorce or separation or gradations of it. So there was a sort of intricate language around the different levels of relationship, and we won't be able to get into them deeply now, but it's a way of grounding us and reminding us we're dealing with real people who have prenups in a way, who are trying to figure out what happens if this doesn't go right, and who have made a personal relationship and also an economic relationship. And so that much as far as just bringing it down to the earth on which these people moved around. Um, this is I bring this because it's almost exactly the time that Paul would have been writing this. It's a an edict by Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, in 52 CE. And here it's described. This isn't the edict itself. In Roman civil law, unions between free female citizens and slave men were regulated under the provisions of the Senatus Consultum Claudianum, in other words, the Claudius's Senate. It was enacted in AD 52 in the reign of the Emperor Claudius and was subjected to important modifications under Hadrian. In its late classical form, the SEC allotted the owner of the slave 2 responses to the union. And here's where we get to something that is important for Corinth, because we know that there were all classes of people in Paul's church in Corinth. And so this measure dealt with the union and the union of a free female citizen and a slave male. And he had options. The owner could permit the union and claim the woman as his freedwoman, or he could, following a formal procedure, enslave the woman and claim her subsequent offspring as his slaves too. Now, why do I bring this? I'm going to go off share for a second. Why do I bring this? Well, because we know that marriage and relationship is complicated, but sometimes when we look back, we think in terms that make us judge them as primitive and less complex as a culture. And these show you that there were live issues of social class, which are not unavailable to us and not they're present among us, right? There were issues of economic difference. There were issues of temporary marriage versus long-term marriage. There were all kinds of issues in the background as Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 7. Well, he wrote his letter, and we made it 1 Corinthians 7. And so um, when we get to the Q&A, please feel free to ask questions about that. But it makes it a richer experience, and I think it helps us know more about what Paul's doing if we get into the intricacies a little bit of the fact that it was a complex relationship and defined variously by various people. And you had to think, can I marry them given the class that they're in, given their station in life, all of those things? It was an intricate social web that they navigated. All right, let's read a bit more. Next section is on virginity. And here's Madonna performing like a virgin. Um, Paul's preference. Would somebody like to read out 7, 8, and 9? This is the section just after the one that we've just read. And here Paul gets to his famous preference. And this is the one I mentioned last week. I've never preached this passage in a wedding for reasons you'll see in a moment. Somebody want to read it out?
Alan, I will.
Yes,
Sandy,
good.
to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion.
All right. So you have here Paul's very romantic view. Marriage is for those who cannot abstain, right? Who aren't gifted with celibacy. And we'll get to this later also in the chapter because he sounds it out here and then he goes to a lot of different other permutations, but then he comes back in 17 through 38. And I want you to turn to that in your Bible, and I'm just going to summarize here how he argues for celibacy and singleness and virginity. He begins in 17 by describing a general principle that he hopes they will keep among themselves. He says, in light of the fact that the time may be short, and this somebody asked last week about the apocalypse and how much timeline did Paul see happening in the world? Was Paul buying green bananas? Was he looking out for a long-term ministry, or was he thinking the second coming was imminent? And here he says, we don't know really. So why don't you just stay in the same state in which you were called? So, if you were circumcised when you were called, stay circumcised. If you were uncircumcised when you were called, stay uncircumcised. If you were a slave when you were called, stay a slave. If you were free when called, stay free. And I give these two because Paul uses them as analogies or illustrations, not because he goes long on them. I don't think he cares about them actually. I think he's trying to set up what's next, which is if you were a virgin, if you were single when you got called to Christ. Remember the opening line of the letter is to the people of Christ in Corinth called to be saints, right? We got that kletos, Greek word kletos, that means called. So when you were called, Paul is saying, if you were single when you were called, stay single. If you were married, stay married. And in that, he says, if you marry now, if you don't take my advice and stay in the same state, if you marry now, it's not a sin. Marriage isn't recommended, but it's not going to count against you in the great yonder, right? Um, and here are the two reasons he gives why marriage would be better to avoid than to engage in or move toward. The first is that it produces anxiety. Um, he starts out with it produces anxieties as in troubles, and then he moves to it divides attention because he as a single guy can just focus on the Lord, but a non-single person has to focus on the partner, and that splits the allegiance or splits the attention at least. And so Paul is going to come back and Sandy just read a very brief it's better to marry than to burn with lust, but I wish you could all be as I am, right? The end of the chapter goes long on that. So Paul really wants to drive home the superiority of celibacy, the superiority of singleness, and he spends a lot of time on it in this chapter. It's another thing I'm going to ask him about when I meet him someday. But here's the deal. Paul's criteria are about the gospel. And he looks around him and sees that he has more time and freedom to do whatever the call entails than his married brothers and sisters as he observes them. Right? We know he worked with Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. We know that later in chapter 9, he's going to say, Peter has a wife and people pay for both of them and all of those things. We know that he's aware of pastors, of missionaries, of whatever we're going to call them, of agents of the gospel who are married, and his observations, at least, have made him very glad that he is free and not encumbered. Right? This has become throughout history. It has some part in the celibacy of the clergy in certain orders and in the Roman Catholic Church. Um, but it can be interpreted in a way that goes where Paul goes with it, which is if something gets in my way as a gospel guy, Some somewhere he says, "Woe to me if I don't preach the gospel." Right? If something has a chance to get in my way as a gospeler, I'm not going to do it. And so we can imagine for a moment, we could imagine a situation in which somebody in the Corinthian congregation comes to Paul and says, "You know, Paul, we completely get you on that singleness thing. But we're not marrying because we can't handle it sexually to be apart. We're marrying because it gets us into context to spread the gospel that we wouldn't get into if we weren't married. There have been missionaries through the ages who have had better access as married people than as single people, for instance. And I'm posing this as a hypothetical because I want us to focus in on why Paul doesn't like marriage. It's not a sort of he doesn't see it as an evil enterprise. He sees it as a potential distraction, and for him, something to be avoided if marriage becomes an enhancer of someone's mission or ministry. I believe that Paul would answer, and this is hypothetical, and I'm going to ask him someday, but I believe that Paul would answer back, if it's getting the gospel forward, I want it for you. Right? Now, motives are all kinds of mix. But I think we ought to focus on the thing that makes Paul like singleness and celibacy here. It's not the evil of sex itself, it's not the evil of male female continuing relationships, it's not the evil of continuing relationships. And we talked for a moment last week about the ongoing conversation about homosexuality in the Bible. If there's a whole other hatch here that could open if two people of same sex uh, relationship came and said, "This is making our ministry more powerful." You see that I want us to focus on the very center of why Paul makes the decisions he makes rhetorically here. He wants nothing to get in the way of the gospel. Philippians. In Philippians, he's sitting in prison and unable to go out and preach. So he starts converting the guards who are assigned to watch him. That's how gospeling Paul is. And as he does that, he's also hearing that there are preachers out there who are preaching from bad motive. And he says, you know what? Let them go. The gospel is going out. In that I rejoice. Paul's central call in life is to move the gospel of Jesus into as many spaces as he can. He senses a call to the Gentiles, but we know he talked to the synagogues. We know that he talked to gatherings of Jewish people. Paul was about moving the gospel into the world. Here, he only doesn't like marriage when it gets in the way of that. Does that make sense? Now, that's not a brief against celibate clergy. It's just to say, if we're going to understand Paul, we need to understand the centrality of gospeling for him. It was his whole life. Anything that got in the way of it was not okay with him. So let's come down the home stretch and finish the run. So divorce is a question that Paul treats in this section, and he goes at it in a way that is similar to the one that he did with the stay the same logic, but it's more sensitive than some picture Paul being. To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord. This comes right after the I prefer singleness, but if you are going to burn with lust, go ahead and get married. He was speaking to the single there. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband shouldn't divorce his wife. This is in Mark 12, in Matthew 22. So this is part of the Jesus tradition that made its way to Paul somehow. We've talked before about how Paul doesn't cite parables or healings or doesn't talk about what we might call the historical Jesus very often. Here he cites the Lord as his source, and this is how it shows up in Mark's gospel. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce the husband. So stay the way you are, in a way, right? That logic we saw earlier. For the unbelieving husband, this is a very interesting section. The unbelieving husband is made holy or sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy, sanctified through, and notice the brother comes in here. Um, this is part of what caused early Christians to be misunderstood in their environments. They received criticism for being incestuous because they called one another brother and sister and then married one another. And that I would have been confused if I was a neighbor. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they're holy. Now, this is coming from a Jewish Pharisee, from a line of from a Jewish tradition in which bloodlines are important, and so you see him kind of parsing out this part of the Christian endeavor, and I think we can see behind Paul's eyes here. Otherwise, let's see, would those children be unclean? Yeah, I guess they would. So they have to be sanctified through the believing parent in Paul's calculus. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. And this is where I think people are probably going to be surprised by Paul. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called us. Wife, for all you know, you might have saved your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. But notice he's giving permission to let the marriage dissolve if in terms elsewhere it's unequally yoked, but not on the believer's instigation, but on the non-believer's instigation if there's a mixed marriage, uh, religiously mixed marriage. So this is all of this is getting at small nuances in Paul's thought and Paul's pastoral approach that are fascinating, I think. So we've been through. What do you do about marriage if you think it's super spiritual to be celibate? What do you do about the body and what it means and why we should care about it? What do you do about singleness, about marriage, about different phases of marriage in ancient Corinth? What do you do about mixed marriages between a believer and somebody who isn't a person of faith? We've got basically case law without case law. Paul doesn't ever get legal about it here, but he is given a whole lot of permutations of how life can go. And he wants them to know that this faith thing that they've entered is not some sort of barter system with God, which is what religion would have been in their world. And it's not merely a philosophical school, which is what philosophy would have been in their world. In Paul's theology and in his pastoring, he marries the religious element that they knew with the philosophical element that they knew, and life and behavior and ethics matter. And here he's taking it right down to the ground level with them over and over and over. When I was a professor back in former days, and when I decided to move into parish ministry, my first stop was New Canaan, Connecticut for the Congregational Church of New Canaan. And as I arrived, we engaged with a guy named Christian Sharon, who was working with Miroslav Volf at the Institute for the Center for Faith and Culture at Yale, and he was running a campaign called Faith as a Way of Life. They had gotten a big Lilly grant, but the purpose was to move through Christian communities and remind us that the intricacies of life are faith related, one and all. That seems to me what Paul is doing by getting so granular in his response to these Corinthians. He's saying the things you do in your body matter ultimately within the economy of God. So let's talk about them. We don't know how dogmatic he would be about any one of these assessments, any one of these answers, right? We don't know how dogmatic he would have been, and in other places there are ways in which he bends or answers differently. What we know is that the overall program seems to be your life lived in this world matters to the God who made you. What you do in your body matters. What you do in relationships matter. What you do in the minutes and hours and days of your lives matter as a part of who you are as a host of the eternal God, as one in whom the Holy Spirit dwells. So tonight, maybe more than any other time in the letter, we get very close to the ground and we deal with something that every life has questions about. And Paul went there with them because of how he thought of what faith was. Faith for Paul was a way of life, and there wasn't a part of his life that was untouched by it. He wanted to pass that on. And in chapter 11, verse 1, he'll put it in very brief terms. He'll say, imitate me as I imitate Christ.